Hello and welcome back. This is Dan Perry and this is my Masters of Science dissertation, The Hiding Curriculum Towards the Development of LGBTQ+ Curriculum. This is Chapter 1. It's about time LGBTQ+ curriculum development in higher education, the curriculum and curricula as chronobiopolitics. This presentation is called Modernisms, Metanarratives, Structuralisms, Sociological Essentialism, and Biological Determinism. That was a mouthful. These are all background theories that underpin both the timeline and the wider dissertation. Don't worry, there isn't a test at the end of this, and these theories can be quite challenging. Hopefully I explain them well. Just one small side note, there are a few trigger warnings in this presentation. I make reference to stereotypes, genetics indirectly, and have images of totalitarian leaders in this presentation. But without further ado, let's move forward into the overview. But before we get into the isms, I thought I should look at the ideas around the Enlightenment, which our education systems are still currently based on. We then move into modernism and metanarratives, postmodernism, structuralism, post-structuralism, sociological essentialism, and biological determinism. So why are we talking about the Enlightenment? Well, it's what our current education system is based upon. As you'll remember, and hopefully have seen the video on hidden curriculum, Apple has said that academia puts high value on statistics, positivist ideas, and teaching marketplace ideals, and this is why. I thought I should very briefly outline what I believe the Enlightenment's core principles were, and in highlighting some of the ideas which informed their thinking back then, and what the modern system of education is currently based upon. The online Britannica dictionary defines Enlightenment as a European intellectual movement of the 17th and 18th centuries, in which ideas concerning God, reason, nature, and humanity were synthesized into a worldview that gained wide assent in the West, and that instigated revolutionary developments in art, philosophy, and politics. These are what I believe to be some of the core principles: eradication of religious authority, individual liberty, democracy, freedom of expression, and utopia. Our current education system is based around their philosophy, which is the theory that reason rather than experience is the foundation of certainty in knowledge. Now, what comes underneath this to make this philosophy? Well, there is rationalism, empiricism, universalism, and the scientific method. So, rationalism is the practice or principle of basing opinions and actions on reason and knowledge, rather than on religious belief or emotional response. Empiricism is the capability of being verified or disproved by observation or experiment. Universalism is a cultural trait characteristic of all normal adult members of a particular society. The scientific method, which is quite a large part of this, is a method or procedure that has characterized natural science since the 17th century, consisting in systematic observation, measurement, and experiment, and the formulation, testing, and modification of hypotheses even. Please remember my theoretical lens here, querying curriculum interruptions, disruptions, gaps, and silences, which hopefully you have seen. This presentation is a bit octopus-like. I give lots of tentacles, but don't necessarily tie them up just yet. So this is more for reference when we go through the main body. But yeah, just keep that in mind for now. We now move on to modernism. So we're going to look at modernism first and then move on to meta-narratives. Modernism basically rejected what came before in the pre-modern period. So this is roughly before the 1860s. But as you'll see as we move on, parts of what came before relate to modernism. So yeah, modernism is also tied to meta-narratives, as we'll see in the next slides coming up. So modernism refers to a global movement in society and culture that from the early decades of the 20th century saw a new alignment with the experience and values of modern industrial life. Building on late 19th century precedents, artists around the world used new imagery, materials, techniques to create artworks that they felt better reflected the realities and hopes of modern societies. At the core of modernism lay the idea that the world had to be fundamentally rethought. The carnage of the First World War and the Russian Revolution led to a widespread utopian fervor, a belief that the human condition could be healed by new approaches to art and design, focusing on the most basic elements of daily life, housing and furniture, domestic goods and clothes. Architects and designers set out to reinvent these forms for a new century. So now we've got a little bit of an idea of what modernism is, I'm going to be exploring meta-narratives which are more relevant than modernism, and is why I've kind of briefly skipped over it, because it's an entire subject in itself. Meta-narratives are overarching narratives created in modernism that try to make society objectively better, whether through art, architecture, technology, or politics. These are a few examples. We're going to pick up politics. So in the case of politics, movements see themselves as a defining ideology that can make a society a better place or utopia to live in. Some examples on the left here, we've got Maoism, Nazism, Stalinism, and fascism. So meta-narratives give a complete and overarching account of history and experiences of social and cultural occurrences. So these narratives become legitimized as truth through power, authority, and social customs by giving accounts of history and by suppressing voices and experiences that challenge this legitimacy. So we're going to, again, just briefly leave this here. I'm going to go on to postmodernism, and it will tie up a little, at least. So, what is postmodernism? Well, there is no single definition of postmodernism. It's much a contested term still. However, there is some agreement that postmodernism is a rejection and or rethinking of modernism. Postmodernism is one of the most controversial movements in art and design history. Over 2 decades, from about 1970 to 1990, postmodernism shattered established ideas about art and design, bringing a new self-awareness about style itself. An unstable mix of the theatrical and theoretical, postmodernism ranges from the ludicrous to the luxurious, a visually thrilling, multifaceted style. However, for the purpose of this dissertation, I obviously had to define postmodern as something. So I would argue that Lyotard's 1983 definition of the postmodern is the most useful for this dissertation, this presentation. A work can become modern only if it is first postmodern. Postmodernism is thus understood not as modernism at its end, but in a nascent state, and this state is constant. So, in other words, there is no clear separation between the modern and the postmodern. It needs to be ahead of its time, postmodern, to become modern and is in a constant state of flux. So to define post-structuralism, which is our next step, it is similar to the postmodern, and you need to be able to understand what structuralism is to understand post-structuralism. And I apologise in advance, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. We move on to structuralism. Saussure, a structural linguist, thought that a signifier, which is a sound and image, are fused together with the signified. This is an underlying concept, that are combined to make a sign. For example, the word cat could be the sound and image typed, but what makes this cat a cat? The underlying concept, the signified, is cat-like. Things that we can agree on, so like it has a tail, 4 legs and fur. However, to signify a cat, we need something to be described as everything that is in its opposition to catness. No, not Miss Everdeen. Meaning all that is not cat or cat-like is something else. Saussure thought that the underlying concept, the signified, was universally shared across cultures because they were fixed and stable. Because everyone understands the same thing when they see a signifier, in this case a cat, this will have the same signified concept and understand it in the same way across all cultures across the world. Moving on, Levi Strauss was inspired by the structural linguist Saussure to create the notion of structural anthropology. Structural anthropology is the belief that all humans are subject to interpreting the world through structural principles. Levi Strauss argued that all societies globally have the same counterparts of binary logic as Saussure did. That is interpreted as being fixed and stable in meaning. The post-structuralist Derrida challenges the notion that all signified, that is, the concept, have universally shared meanings, both in Saussure's structural linguistics and Levi Strauss's structural anthropology. Derrida argues that meaning, that is, the signifier, is always concept-specific, at a certain point, at a certain time, and are different for different people. Derrida means that people do not objectively interpret the world through universally held, stable, fixed meanings, which are signified. An example of this would be the word bomb. Imagine for a moment what this means. I bet you thought this, which obviously bomb can mean an explosive, but did you think of this as in a box office bomb, or this as in that's bomb, meaning that's good, or indeed this as a graffiti slang, meaning to paint many surfaces at a time in an area? This is what Derrida has challenged by the signified, the concept underneath words. The signified for Derrida is understood by the cultural discourses and the ideas that are around at a specific time and place they are used. Derrida therefore advances the idea that signifiers are empty because people do not understand anything to an underlying fixed and stable universalism. Derrida's ideas could be used in queer theory to examine concepts by deconstructing and examining them for power structures and then reconstructing their meanings. This will become relevant later on. Now, we're leaving that behind and jumping ahead a bit, but this will all kind of make sense later on as we go through, and you can refer back to any of this presentation or indeed the other one as we go through the timeline. So, sociological essentialism, I would argue, is similar to biological determinism. So biological determinism is the belief that all behaviour, and in particular deviant behaviour, is intrinsically fixed in human genes that determine traits and characteristics in certain groups of people. Now, I've got Fagin on the left here for a very specific reason. In the chapter that they discuss this, they talk about Oliver Twist, which I'm not going to go into, but I really recommend you track the book down. Both Oliver Twist, but also Lewontin's book as well, which I will put references in another slide thing, because it's really interesting. It really makes you look at Oliver in a different way completely, if you're not already seeing it in that way. Anyway, I use Lewontin and others' explanation of reductionism here, as I found it useful to understand the term. Reductionism is a method of generalizing and simplifying complex societies to an individual person's behavior in that society. I would argue this is very similar to some stereotypes of groups of people, but are reduced down to a particular behavior or perceived traits. Now, this is as far as I'm going with this for now. We will probably mention them again as we go through the timeline, but for the moment, I would thank you for joining me. Remember, this presentation and the next presentation will all tie in together when we get deeper into the dissertation and into the actual timeline. See you next time for part 2 of the theoretical underpinnings. It's called Community Activism, LGBT Studies, Queer Theory, Radicalism, and the Homophile Movement. I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you. Bye.